So, DigitalOcean, how good is your API? I'm going to do a review of it today to find out the truth. Join me and let's go through the documentation. As you can see, they got a pretty nice website targeted at people like us, developers. Let's dive into the documentation and see what we can find out. They've got a pretty nice documentation portal with a few different APIs. We are going to focus solely on the DigitalOcean API reference instead of any of the others. The DigitalOcean API documentation is pretty clean, pretty straightforward. We can see what we might need, where we might want to go. It all looks pretty good. The general information, it explains the different usages of the HTTP verbs that they support, as well as the status codes and how they respond, which is always helpful in API documentation and you don't see it that often. It explains how their rate limiting is used and how you can understand the rate limits that you will have on your account. Also goes nicely into detail on the cross-origin resource sharing aspect, or CORS as you might know it as, and tells you what and how to work with their API in certain situations. So let's talk about the authentication for a moment. They use an OAuth bearer token which you can generate from your account, and you add that as an authorization bearer token. There's three different types. There's the personal access tokens that you can generate from the control panel. There's the tokens that are generated that use the OAuth flow, and then finally there's the OAuth refresh tokens. Each ones have different prefixes, so they're easily identifiable. I'm not sure how that works from a security perspective, whether the prefix is kind of a internal thing and that the rest of the token is interchangeable, but it would be an interesting thing to find out. So let's dive into a couple of these resources. Let's start with the account itself. You can get your account information really quickly and really easily using the account endpoint. You can see that they are versioning their API. They've got a V2 endpoint, which for them makes a lot of sense. In the past, I've talked about versioning in APIs, and personally, I don't feel you need it very often. But in their situation, where they went from a somewhat basic cloud provider to what they are today, they had to introduce that versioning because they were making so many big sweeping changes. If we look at the documentation for getting a user's account, it explains really nicely the different responses that you might get, from a 200 OK, 401 unauthorized, 420 time rate limit exceeded, a 500 server error, and then they have a default kind of unexpected error as well. It would be nice to see those errors with a little bit more detail, because they are a little bit lightweight. They've got an ID and a message, but not much else. They could really look to incorporate something like JSON API standards and problem API, just to really go above and beyond on those error reporting issues that you may find. But other than that, the responses are pretty nice. And I like the way that the singular resources that are passed back have a singular key, and that the collection of objects are returned with a pluralized key. Instead of it just being within a data key for everything, it adds that little bit of contextual awareness, which is always nice to see in an API. Let's look at an example here. Under the apps resource, we want to create a new app. We send our payload. It's got an accept header for the content type you will accept and the content type that you are sending over as a payload. They accept both JSON and YAML, which, fair enough. Personally, I don't think YAML should be sent in this way, but I can see their use case. The body itself requires a specific specification, which they call the app spec. And then they have the project ID as a string, which is an optional request body parameter. only thing that I would say is that the project ID feels like an afterthought. And if I look through a lot of the things in this API, the project ID is always tacked on the end as an optional because it may or may not be needed. That to me would make sense as a custom header. And I found my first problem. So when you're creating a new app using the apps endpoint, you send over your payload and the available responses, obviously the error responses are 401, 429, 500 and the default. But if you don't encounter an error, they give you a 200 response back saying that request was okay. This is where my problem sits, is that you are creating a resource. So if it's created instantly, that should be a 201. If you are creating it in the background, that should be a 202, request accepted. And it should tell you some information. Just saying 200 OK, that doesn't work with post requests when you're creating resources, because it's not okay. You're not giving me a status or an understanding of what happened, what next steps there are. 201, I've created it, fantastic, thank you. 202, okay, I'll check back later because you've got some background work you need to do to actually create this resource. That is the one thing I've noticed within this API where I've found a problem. Next up, let's talk about deleting a resource. When you do a delete request to the apps endpoint, providing the ID, you receive a 200 response back with the ID of what you've just deleted. Now that might make sense, but it leaves me a little bit confused. So, have I deleted the resource? Yes or no? If I've deleted the resource, that ID should no longer be valid, and I should be receiving a 204, no content, or a 202, we've accepted your request and we're going to do some work to actually delete this resource in the background. Is it instant? Then give a 204. If it's not instant, give a 202. Giving a 200 response, saying that okay, and here's the ID of what you just deleted. I don't need that ID. I don't want that ID. What I want is no content, knowing that I've done what I've asked you to do, or a message in a 202 saying we've accepted your request. This may take 10 minutes because we've got to do all of these background jobs. That to me is acceptable, but a 200 with an ID that I literally just passed you, that isn't me deleting a resource. Sorry. Needless to say, it's not all bad. If we look at something like listing all domain records, which is a GET request to /v2/domains/ the domain name /records, that is a good endpoint. Consistent pluralization, you're using something that makes sense within the URL as a parameter path, and we're getting a 200 response, which makes sense. It is a collection, so we've got the pluralized key within that response. We've got an empty links because there's nothing else we need to see. But if there's additional links, we'll start to see things like first and last in there. That's great. Then within meta, we've got a total of how many are actually within the domain records themselves. So the query parameters, we can pass through a name. So you can filter using the name, which is pretty handy. Maybe you've got multiple in there. You can pass through a type, so you can say, I only want the domain records that are a CNAME or MX, for example, per page and page. That to me it's quite reasonable. But if you're going to use query parameters to filter and sort and do anything with the data that's coming back, you need to pick a relatively good standard. Something such as JSON API. So you want to do something like filter equals name for filtering for a subdomain, or maybe filter type equals CNAME or MX, so you can filter it that way. So I want to see a little bit more improvement on the use of query parameters. But overall, it's a good endpoint, got good naming consistency, responses are good, the response bodies are good. Using query parameters to filter and sort data is an important part of an API, but getting the way you use those query parameters correct, that's where the art form comes into the API. And while DigitalOcean are absolutely fantastic at providing cloud solutions, some of the API areas could definitely do with polishing to improve upon. For the final step, let's upload the Open API specification to API Insights and see how it comes out. We've got 299 endpoints, analysed very quickly, and we got a bad score. So if we have a look, design-wise, consistent pluralization with failing, robust responses with failing, rate limiting with failing, and consistent noun usage with failing. We are passing on versioning, JSON support, and the multiple HTTP methods. But what I'm assuming is happening here is that the specification doesn't explain fully all of the different responses and how to use rate limiting. The consistent pluralization is failing because we've got a few action endpoints, so we're not following the REST standard where resources and anything going on within your URI should be a pluralized version of it. Now if we jump down to performance, we're not seeing any cache or compression support. There may be cache and there may be compression, but we're just not seeing it when we're interrogating the API or when we're analyzing the Open API specification. From a security perspective, authorization is appearing everywhere, which is good. They are using secure URLs, again, good. But what I'm seeing with most APIs is that they aren't documenting the additional optional security headers that you might want to add, such as CSP headers or strict transport security or the content type options or anything along those lines. Overall, while API Insights might be scoring this quite low, I would say that the DigitalOcean API is actually a very good API. It's very well built, it's very robust. The actual documentation compared to the specification is very well written, and you can really understand all of the different options that you might need or can choose. Obviously, I've had a bit of a problem with the responses that come back where 200 okay for all the things isn't okay, but overall I would definitely say that this API is approved by Steve. Don't forget to check out API Insights at apiinsights.io or search API Insights on the Mac Store to see how good your API really is.